Hi everyone, this is a video for the Houston EMP Prepper Meetup. We've had our first meeting. There's been a couple of things that have changed since then. The name of the group has changed from the Houston Survivalism Meetup to the Houston EMP Prepper Meetup. I did that because after the first meetup I realized that the focus of this meetup really should be about EMP. That's really what I believe we need to prepare for, and that's really what I should have named the meetup to begin with. So I changed the name. Now it's Houston EMP Prepper Meetup. And like I said, we had our first meetup a while back, and we've been talking, my wife and I and members, about what we should do for the next meetup. And excuse me, one of the things that we've decided to do is to create these videos that cover what we did in the first meetup so that we could provide it for members who weren't there at the first meetup. They could watch these videos, and in essence they could catch up and be where we are, because this is fundamental. What's in these videos is fundamental to understand the entire point of this meetup. So without it, if you just showed up for the second meetup and we were covering firearms, or we're covering suturing wounds or whatever, you wouldn't have a foundation or a context as to why we're doing those things. Excuse me, I got a bit of a problem with my throat. So I wanted to create these videos. There will be 4 videos. The first one is this one, which is what is an EMP. It goes into some detail as to what an EMP is and why we should really be worried about it, and why we should prepare for it over any other scenario. The next video will be the EMP scenario walkthrough, and there's a video within that as well. The third video will be a plan to prepare for the day of Teotihuacan, which is the end of the world as we know it. And the fourth video, the final video, is a plan of action. So the key difference there is those underlined words. One is what to do now to prepare for that day, and the other plan is a plan of action for that day, for the day it happens. In addition, that last video will cover resources and contact information for myself. All right, let's get going. Your question might be, why should I prepare for this? Why is this important? If you're not prepared, you are preparing to fail. It's very true. I mean, if you have no plan at all, you're guaranteed you're going to fail pretty much. But at least if you make some plan to prepare, you have a chance to succeed. And I kind of think of it as similar to insurance, medical insurance. You know, we get medical insurance not really to cover colds and the flu. The true purpose of medical insurance is to cover us against catastrophic injury or illness. Those that's going to take everything we have, all our money, all our savings, getting loans and everything else. If we were to get one of those illnesses and we didn't have insurance, we'd be wiped out. We might lose our home, our cars, whatever. So the purpose of the insurance is to step in at that point and cover that. And that way you're not basically financially destroyed. That is what this is about. This is us preparing for the worst case scenario. If you prepare for that, anything less than that is no problem. And I started preparing or prepping back when Hurricane Rita was a problem for us up here in the northeast of the city. If you went through it, you know what I'm talking about. But basically the city fell apart. They waited, I believe, if I recall correctly, it didn't look like the hurricane was going to hit us up until right before, and then they panicked and tried to get everybody out of the city. And you know, you have 2 million people trying to get out on Houston's freeways, and it clogged everything up. And as I said, I'm on the outskirts of the city, so we watched it kind of going through. And at one point, I went out the next morning, or the morning of that the hurricane was going to hit. That morning, I went out to get some gas to a local gas station, and I knew the owner at that gas station. It's just a mom and pop type of setup. And I went there, and there were about 30 cars surrounding the place, tons of people standing in front of it. It looked dangerous. As I drove up, I realized I hadn't thought this through. I had my nephew in the car, my dad in the car, who's elderly, and I hadn't really thought this through. I had no idea that once I got out into the street, out to near the freeway, there would be that kind of a situation there. And as I drove by slowly to catch a look in and see what was going on, because I knew, like I said, I knew the owner, I saw him and his son sitting inside the store. The doors were barred, and they were holding shotguns. And there were people at the door trying to get in. And I realized then that quickly, our society was starting to fall apart. The hurricane hadn't even hit yet. And there were people confronting someone holding a shotgun, demanding to get gas, although he had a sign that said no gas. They were out. And that made me realize that we put a lot of trust in everyone around us keeping their act together when confronted with something serious like this. And I think that's a big mistake. The reality is that most people have no idea how to survive or how to handle things. They'll fall apart, and very quickly things will turn ugly. And I saw it there firsthand. So that kind of opened my eyes, and I started to think about what's going to happen when something really big does happen. If it took just that much to get people to start getting violent, and you've seen it on TV and the news and videos, it doesn't take very much. So that kind of got me going on down this road. What's an EMP? If you haven't heard of an EMP, it stands for electromagnetic pulse. Basically, it's a nuclear weapon going off or a solar flare coming and hitting the earth. So there's two types in there, and I'll cover them here a little bit more. But if you prepare basically for this, and you're covered for this and can survive this, you'll be able to survive everything else below it, including hurricanes and you name it. That's why when I've been asked about, well, you're going to cover hurricanes and preparedness for hurricanes or floods. No, I'm not. I'm going to cover this. And if you are in this meetup, you need to be aware that this is what we're going to cover. This is what we're going to prepare for. It is the end of the prepping. I mean, if you can prepare for this and survive this, everything else is going to be a cakewalk for you. So that's why I focus on this. The point of an EMP, and the reason an EMP is so dangerous, is that an EMP, whether it comes from the sun or whether it comes from a nuclear attack, it's going to knock out the grid. Our grid is our electrical grid across the entire country, what provides power for your home and businesses, and the stoplights and the lights out on the street. Every single thing that is running on electricity across this country depends on our electrical grid. And an EMP will knock that out nationwide. Now, what about other things that can happen that people say, well, we should prepare for economic collapse or hurricanes or tornadoes, earthquakes or floods? If you look at each one of these in turn, in economic collapse, for example, in that situation, the government's still going to be running. Banking, utilities, all of those things are likely to still be operating. They won't be completely devastated. They might be affected, but they won't be completely knocked out. Not to mention that an economic collapse is going to be temporary. It's not going to be forever. It might last years, but basically in worst cases, but I'm rather confident that we will be able to recover from something like that. We did it in the Great Depression in 28 in a situation when we were much less prepared and much less capable, and we recovered from that. Hurricanes and tornadoes, those are localized, those are temporary. Earthquakes are also temporary, and generally localized. That means that they happen in an immediate area. They might happen, a tornado or hurricane might hit this part of the country. It's not going to affect California. It's not going to affect New York. So those other parts of the country can help us. If we get hit by a hurricane, for example, the federal government can come in and help us. Floods, same thing. We've seen dozens of floods across the country. And while that area might be hurt, other parts of the country are able to step in and help. That's why these things are different from an EMP. As I mentioned before, there are two ways to knock out the grid. There are two EMP types, but if we step back away from EMP, there's another way to knock out the grid aside from an EMP, and that is that the grid itself can be hacked. That should scare the heck out of you, because if you've noticed, hacking has been performed at the highest levels of our government. Hackers have been able to get in. They're in there reading, political emails and things like that really are child's play compared to what they could really be doing if they first off wanted to or were given permission. And that is, they could go in there and hack our grid. We have three grids: the East Coast grid, the Texas coast, the Texas grid, and the West Coast grid. These three grids provide all the electricity for our country. Now, from studies and publications, we know that Russia and China have already hacked our grid. They've already been in, they've looked around. But Russia and China are less likely to attack our grid through hacking, because our economies are interdependent. And they're no idiots. We would likely find out who did it, and then they'd have to pay for that. So much like we were able to survive the Cold War with the Soviet Union, because we knew that we would each wipe each other out, I think that this is much less of a danger. Now, Iran, North Korea, ISIS, or other terror groups, they're all been probing. They've been trying to see how things run and what they can find out. They are less or not at all interconnected with the West. Iran, North Korea, and ISIS, think about it, they don't care if we go down, because it's not likely to affect them very much. So that takes that deterrent away. Now, even though they're less capable, they can hire third-party mercenaries. At the time that I put this together, ISIS was reported to have $2 billion in cash or gold and other things. So they have the funds if they wanted to hire people to come in and try to hack us. Now, and I believe that ISIS, as one particular entity, is much more dangerous than the Nazis, for example, ever were. If you think about the worst of the worst, everybody always goes to the Nazis. The Nazis, you're as bad as Hitler, this, that, the other. You always go to the Nazis. Why? Because they were the worst. But I believe they pale in comparison to ISIS, because Nazis were ordered and controlled by Hitler. But ISIS is ordered and controlled by their God. So it's one thing to follow a man. It's quite another to say, God is telling me to do this. And that makes them even more dangerous in my eyes. All right, the second way that you can knock out the grid is through an EMP. And as I mentioned before, EMPs come in two types. The natural kind, which comes from the sun. These are basically explosions that happen on the sun's surface, and it sends out the EMP. Now, they're constantly going out from the sun all the time. The problem is that the Earth is spinning around the sun, and the EMP may go out in one direction while the Earth is in another direction, so it never hits us. But every once in a while, and there's been some estimates that every 75 years or so, I'm not so sure that that's correct, because we don't really have a track record going back past 150 years or so. But we have been hit by these before. And if you want to research it, look up the Carrington event. Carrington, Carrington. That was an EMP that hit us from the sun in the 1850s or 60s, I believe it was, and it knocked out what we had at the time, which was very rudimentary electrical grid. But it knocked it out. It started fires because of the electricity that was sent through those wires from the EMP that we got hit from. It knocked out telegraph offices. It shocked telegraph operators as the pulse of electricity came through the wires. It came into the office and literally shocked and knocked people out. This is in 1850 something, 60 something that this event happened, and it was in comparison, or in studies from today, they actually believe that wasn't even as big as it could have been. That there are some that could be as much as 10 times worse. So there's a book called The Sun Kings. I believe the author's name is Clark. It's been recommended and covers that entire event. So if you want to kind of know a little bit more about that. The problem with the EMPs from the sun is that they're random in timing and location and effect. Actually, the second part of that is not quite true, because it is estimated and believed that an actual EMP from the sun, a big one hitting the earth directly, would be even worse than an EMP from a nuclear attack. Because an EMP from a nuclear attack against the United States, for example, would affect North America, the US, and maybe parts of Mexico, parts of Canada. But it would be localized to us. Europe wouldn't be affected. An EMP from the sun, a big one coming in and having a direct hit on the earth, would knock out the entire globe. The grid of the world. You want to talk about a nightmare. It's bad enough going through this exercise here and trying to figure out what would happen to us here. Imagine it happening worldwide. We have anywhere from 12 hours to 3 days of warning with an EMP from the sun. So there's not a lot of time, really. One of the things that can be done by the government is they could shut down the grid. They could come out and say, because if they shut it down, there's potential for less damage. So they could actually get in there and shut down the grid before it hits us and simply try to limit the damage that way. But the big but here is this. As I mentioned before, our grid is 3 parts: West Coast, the East Coast, and Texas. In order to start up one of the other grids that is turned down or shut down, you need one of the other 2 grids to be running. It's almost like it needs a jump start. Well, in this scenario where the Earth is getting hit by an EMP from the sun and you shut down the entire grid, how do you start it back up? This is literally a problem that they've been trying to deal with and that they are aware of. So another problem there. The other type of EMP other than the sun is a man-made, and that's a nuclear warhead, a nuclear bomb as we've come to know them growing up. If you have a nuclear attack on Earth, on the surface of the Earth, for example, we see what we see in the videos of Hiroshima or Nagasaki in Japan from World War II. Basically, the city is wiped out. Buildings are knocked down. Trees are burned away. People are disintegrated. That is what happens when you blow up a nuclear warhead. But if you take that same nuclear warhead and detonate it 300 miles above the Earth, so instead of blowing it off on the surface or close to the surface, you blow it off up 300 miles up or thereabouts, you get a completely different effect. Nothing on the ground as far as buildings or people or trees or anything is affected, except for the electrical grid. Now, for this man-made nuclear warhead, the problem, unlike the one coming from the sun, is that for these, there's no warning. Their system is that if Iran were to take a Scud missile with a nuclear warhead and launch it from the Gulf of Mexico or the East Coast, we would have anywhere from 5 to 7 minutes, and that's just not enough time to do anything about it. So in essence, there is no warning for one of these attacks. The other thing to be concerned about with this is that not only is there no warning if it's fired that close to us, but all of our Cold War defensive systems are facing northward, because the shortest route from a nuclear warhead launched from the Soviet Union during the Cold War is for the nuclear weapon to come over the North Pole and hit us. It actually is a shorter route that way than to come around the world sideways. If it comes over the north, it's quicker. So we placed all of our defensive systems facing north to detect those. We also have some on the west coast in Alaska and California that are facing west against China and North Korea, and those would detect those launches coming in from there. But the east coast and the Gulf of Mexico and the southern border, there we have nothing down there. So not only will we not detect a launch coming in from those in the Gulf or the East Coast, if the Russians wanted to, they could actually launch a system coming in from the South Pole under us, and we wouldn't detect it. So we got some serious problems there. Now, all of this that I'm talking about can be found in the studies that were done by the government. There's links at the end of the fourth video that will have links to the actual governmental studies that were performed, and this is all in there. It's telling us the government knows exactly what this is and what can happen, and yet they have done absolutely nothing for over a dozen years now. It's shocking, and you cannot believe it, but it is true. I will give you some resources at the end of these videos that you can watch, where the people who did the studies, these are admirals, retired admirals, and very high-ranking government officials, most of them retired, who were tasked with studying this, and they came up with what I'm showing you here. And yet you can't get the government, the federal government, and our Congress people to get their act together and actually take this seriously. It's beyond understanding how we are sitting in this situation. All right, so this EMP then affects the entire country and could last months or years. Estimates right now are that it would be 18 months. Think about that, 18 months for the entire country without electricity. The most recent videos that I've seen now say that could be as much as 5 years. And one of the things I wanted to cover here real briefly, these estimates of 18 months and 5 years. Estimates are that 80% of the people, previously, when I made this slide, estimates that I had seen where 80% of Americans would die within a year. Actually, probably a lot less than that. But within a year, 80% of Americans would be dead without electricity. And now the estimates are that actually 90% of us would die. And that 5 years after this happened, we would still have 80% of the country without electricity. That is some sobering data. All right, let's break down the actual EMP, the electromagnetic pulse. There's 3 parts to it. Remember, the nuclear weapon goes off 300 miles above us. We might not even see a flash. We wouldn't hear anything. We would certainly not feel anything. It wouldn't knock any buildings down or anything. We just would see the electricity stop. The first part of the EMP is the first component, E1. It's an energy pulse lasting a fraction of a billionth to a few billionths of a second. I mean, this is extremely quick. It is the electromagnetic shock that disrupts or damages electronics-based control systems, sensors, communication systems, protective systems, computers, and similar devices. Basically anything that is electronic, that has computer chips in it, would be damaged or knocked out completely. This damage or disruption occurs essentially simultaneously over the entire country. So if it hit 300 miles up, and I've heard some in these recent videos that they would likely three EMPs would go off simultaneously over the East Coast, the middle of the country, and the West Coast, to basically that's how they would guarantee that the entire country would be knocked out. I don't think it matters. I think if we were to have one part of our grid wiped out, as I'll tell you a little bit later about the kind of damage that we're talking about, I don't think it would matter. If the East Coast was knocked out, we would have serious problems in this country. That would become a wasteland in the East Coast. And I'll get into that in a minute here. The second part of this EMP is the second component, the E2. This is similar to lightning in its time dependence. In other words, the length of time that it happens is more like lightning. Instead of a billionth of a second, it's more like what we see in a lightning bolt. It is far more geographically widespread than a lightning bolt. A lightning bolt hits and it affects one little area. This is spread out over a much wider area. The amplitude or strength of it is somewhat lower. This normally would not be an issue because a lot of electronic systems have protective measures in them against lightning. But because of the E1 component, the first part of it, the instant flash that happens that knocks out protective systems, this part then comes in and actually damages them. So the E1 part knocks out the protective system, and then this E2 part comes in, and now that it's no longer protected, comes in and damages everything behind it. So this is why E2 isn't a problem in an EMP. Then there's the third part, the E3, the third component of an EMP. This is a slower rising, longer duration pulse, and it creates disruptive currents in long transmission lines across our grid. You know those really big, heavy lines that are sitting out there? You've seen them across the country, really. The big lines, and not only those, but every single electrical line that carries electricity in our country, all of those would be damaged. This damage would extend to electrical supply and distribution systems connected to all those lines. So all of those substations and transformers, all of those would be wiped out. Not only that, but the latest videos that I've seen, newest analysis of it says that the amount of load going through those lines would be such that the lines themselves would be damaged and likely explode at the ends where they're connected to the pylons. That would explode there. And what that means to us is this: it's not simply a matter then of restoring our power generation, but now we also have to replace our lines. And you can imagine how much harder that is, as we have hundreds of thousands of miles of electrical lines. They would have to be replaced. This sequence of E1, E2, and E3 can compound the damage. Each later damage increases because of the result of the earlier damage. So this is a nightmare scenario. Now, the effects of an EMP, as far as electronic components are inside all the electronic gear we have, televisions, computers, phones, everything that uses computer chips, all of them are tightly packed. At that level, when the EMP comes through, you're going to get what's called arcing. It can or will occur between those components, and it will short them out or burn them out. There's an example, 2 wires, and you can see the arcing that's going on. This purple line right here, this is arcing. There's electricity in this wire, and it's jumping, or in one of these, and it's jumping across from one wire literally through the air. It is creating a connection. There is no wire here where this pink or purple line is. There's no wire there. The electricity is literally jumping from one wire to the other across thin air. That's called arcing. And that's what's going to happen inside of our electronic equipment at all those chips and everything, they're all going to get basically burnt out. So here's some examples of, or an example of what damage looks like. This is a computer chip. And you can see here the burning or the damage to it. This is fried. This is no good anymore. So it's not going to work. Now let's take this to the next level. Why should we care that the grid goes down? If you look at this graphic here, if all three grids are down, and some people believe in some studies and people believe that even if one of the three grids goes down, all of them would go down. They're interconnected. All three grids are interconnected. They feed each other and draw from each other. And the fear is that even if one of them were to go down, it would take the other two down with them. But put that aside. The reason we should be terrified of this, and the reason we need to call our congressmen, every one of us, and demand that they pay attention to this and follow the recommendations of the commissions. We had one in 2004, a commission on EMP, and they came out and said all this. Basically, we're in critical danger of this. There is nothing that could take our country down like this, and it is doable by the smallest group of people you can imagine. Wouldn't take very many. It doesn't have to be Russia or China. Even Iran could knock us out, or South Korea could knock us out. So the reason why this is so dangerous is if you look at this graphic, everything in our society is interconnected. And it's all interconnected through computerization and electrical power. Computers are everywhere. You've heard that before. Well, guess what? That's exactly why we're in trouble. Because our computers run our oil and gas system or infrastructure through the fuel supplies and compressor stations, our communications. Think about everything, internet, phone lines, everything is computerized. Our water systems are computerized. Our banking and financing are computerized. Our government is computerized. Our entire emergency system infrastructure is computerized. Our transportation across the country is not only computerized, but it's also affected in other ways. And of course, our electrical system is computerized. Now, all of these other systems, if you stop and look at all of them, look at every one of these, they all depend on this one, electrical power. All of them depend on that. You knock out this, and everything else goes down. And in particular, the ones that really concern me is that when this goes out, oil and gas goes out, transportation goes out. So communications go out. So in one attack, our entire grid goes out. Because our grid goes out, we cannot get electricity to our communication systems. And because our cars, our trucks, our 18-wheeler rigs, all of them have computers in them. Your car has computers, like dozens, little computers all over it. Your modern car is computerized. It's going to be knocked out. And that means no gas is going to get from those refineries to the gas station. So your gas station is going to run out of gas quickly. Not only that, those gas station pumps are run by electricity. So it doesn't even matter if there's gas in them. You can't get it out of them without electricity. So imagine that for a second there. No power, no oil, no gas, no transportation, no phones, no communications. And guess what else runs from electricity? Water. Modern systems, water systems, use pumps that are run by electricity. Those pumps go down and your water pressure goes down, and before you know it, you have no water coming out of your faucets. Those that have those big water tanks that use gravity, those small towns and other towns that have those would work until that water in that tank ran out, and then they would be out of water too. So this is the picture that should make everything clear to you, why an EMP is so dangerous. I covered some of these things already in my talk, so I'll just kind of glide over them here. We talked about the 3 grids. They're all interdependent. Now I'm going to go into a little more detail into that graphic that I showed you. And here's the key thing you need to remember. Within telecommunications, think about all these things that are included. TV, radio, internet, computers, cell phones, landlines, ham radios, all modern electronics that have chips or transistors would be wiped out. So everything that deals with communications would be out. Within banking and finance, all your bank branches run on electricity. I don't know about you, but I don't think a lot of banks are going to keep their doors open when they can't track what is going in and out. Some of them might be able to do it through paper, at least initially, when they don't realize that they're out for good. They might be willing to give money out and in by paper record, and I'm certainly going to run out the minute this happens if I'm able to, and get to my bank and try to get the money that I might have in there out. I have some other backups to that, of course, and that is that you should keep money and other valuables like gold and silver or anything like that away and out of the bank, secured for just this kind of a situation. ATMs are all electrical or electronic, so of course they're not going to be working. There's no money to get out of the ATM. Under transportation, yeah, we've seen this in Hollywood, but guess what? It's actually real. Planes, there was about 4,000 airplanes flying above us at any time. That's, if you do the math, about 500,000 people, give or take, are up above us. Any time you stop and think about it, you could pretty much bet there's about 500,000 people above us. That's how many planes are up there. Let's move on to fuel and energy infrastructure. Refineries, of course, are going to be out. They won't have electricity. Another nightmare scenario or nightmare part of all this is the nuclear reactors. We have 2 of them in Texas. There's 100 in the United States altogether. You saw what happened in Japan when they had that earthquake and the tsunami and it knocked out the power. It was the power going out that was running the pumps to keep the water going into the nuclear reactor and keeping all of that cooled down. When the water can't run anymore, then they overheat and they melt. You have a meltdown. Anyway, in Texas, we have 2 of them. The South Texas project is in Matagorda County near Bay City, about 90 miles southwest of Houston. And then also there's a Comanche Peak nuclear power plant, which is in Somerville County near Glen Rose, Texas, about 40 miles south of Fort Worth. So there's 2 of them near enough to us that we need to be aware of them. If you are the type that is into advanced prepping and have a bug out location, a place where you're going to go if and when this all happens, you need to be aware of where these power plants are so that you can avoid them. The big question is, what's going to happen? Well, there are generators at those nuclear plants that are designed to keep the water working. Their problem is that those generators have electronics in them. We don't know if those generators will survive the EMP. Even if they do survive the EMP, how long will they survive for? Most of them have anywhere from 7 days of fuel to 30 days of fuel, and then the fuel runs out and the generators shut down. So then if that happens, or if it happens right off the bat and the generator goes down and there's no electricity, you're going to have a nuclear meltdown. So this is a scary situation. This is something that's also in the commission report. And again, how anybody in Congress could actually have read the report or even the summary and not be sitting there saying, this is our number one priority in the country, should be this. The fact that it isn't tells you they haven't read it, or they don't understand it, or they're just idiots. I think probably a combination of all of that. Let's move on to gas stations. At gas stations, pumps won't work without electricity, so there's no gas to be had. And let's move on to food. There's only 3 days worth of food on store shelves at the supermarket. The minute the power goes out, your refrigeration stops working, of course, and food starts to go bad. So the food that's in refrigeration is going to start to go bad right off the bat. Now, the problem is many of these places won't know that this is permanent, that the EMP knocked us out. They'll think this is a normal, power out situation. So they might leave their doors open and operate through cash only. And that's something that you need to be aware of if this happens, and and I'm going to give you some information as to how to know that what is occurring is an EMP versus a regular power outage. When you know the difference, you have an advantage, and you can make some moves to save yourself and your family and help yourselves. And that is, if you know it's an EMP, you need to get to the bank quickly and see if you can get cash out, and you need to move quickly to the store and get what you can and need quickly, because they might be allowing you to get in there and get stuff out, not knowing that this is a permanent outage. Delivery trucks are not going to be running. They're not going to replenish grocery stores. Why? Because the delivery trucks have computer chips in them and they're burnt out, and also because there's not going to be any fuel. Another key thing to keep in mind is most families in the country have less than a week's worth of food at home. What's going to happen when that food runs out and they go to run across to the supermarket and there's no food there? The water supply. Water facilities require electricity to run on pumps. Most towns use electric pumps to run water up to their water towers. Once the water in those towers runs out, they're out of water. And most people, I would say 95 to 99% of the people do not know how to purify water. I mean, I think most of us know that, most of us know that boiling water purifies it. I wonder if most of us actually do know that. We stopped teaching a lot of stuff in the last 30, 40 years, and I bet most young people don't know that if you boil water, it will make it safe to drink. We have, as a nation, dropped the ball big time with our younger generations. They would not survive a couple of days in this situation. They are so helpless. And that's our fault. And this is part of, hopefully, how we start to fix that. First off, they need to become aware of this problem. And if they become aware of this problem, then they might be open to learning about how to prepare for it. Emergency services. Move on to emergency services. Police, fire department, EMS, they will all be out. There will be no phone service, so there will be no way to call them, even if their phones worked. Even if the phones work, they're not going to be able to get out. They have no fuel. Their vehicles are dead. So add that to the mix. No one to call for help. Now you got prisons. There's 1 million prisoners in the country. What's going to happen with them? What is going to happen to those prisoners? Will they be released when the prison can no longer care for them? There's some dangerous people in there. And I bet there's going to be some people who cannot deal with leaving them in there. They're going to say, I can't just leave them in there. They're going to die. And they're going to open those cells. I'm not passing judgment. I'm just telling you that this is another problem we need to think about if this were to happen. Another thing that is in one of the recent videos, which again I'll put in the resources section, videos to these newer things that I've come across recently. About a quarter of us are on medications. Well, actually, I'm going to cover here in a second, so I'll just hold that and save it to then. Let's move on to nursing homes. What happens when all those nursing homes have no power anymore? No feeding tubes working, no breathing machines working. Many of those elderly people will not survive very long at all without electricity. Most of those nursing homes have generators that kick in when the power goes out, so that it keeps all the medical equipment running. When the power goes out in an EMP and those generators do not work, these people are going to die relatively quickly. So I mentioned about medications, prescriptions. Here's hospitals. Backup generators, of course, will, if they run at all, will quickly run out of fuel. And hospitals have patients. I apparently deleted some text here. Hospitals have patients that will quickly die because they're dependent, much like a nursing home, on these machines to be running. And they're going to simply not be running. And they're going to quickly die. Prescriptions. If you are a diabetic and your medicine needs refrigeration, which it does, then what happens when the power goes on and there's no refrigeration? What about the pharmacies that are not going to be open? Of course, everything's going to be looted. You know that already. We've seen that even in minor situations. The nutcases go out to the streets and immediately start looting and vandalizing, and they will go into supermarkets, pharmacies, Walmarts, every store, every business is going to get knocked out, and there won't be any police ability to stop them. You can't send out the National Guard when the National Guard can't get there because their trucks won't run. And the National Guardsmen who are at home can't get to the base because their cars won't work. So this will be another major problem. What about space systems? There's some doubts. I think this information I got from one of the commission reports, and that is that they believe satellites would be operational. But any ground stations that those satellite systems talk to, of course, will be out. So how much value any of those satellites would be is debatable. Some questions are about GPS working, because they work off of satellite systems. If your GPS is protected, you manage to protect it and it doesn't die in the initial EMP, it could be talking to that satellite that's still running up there. That's a toss-up. Nobody really knows. But it is something to be aware of. Does that mean that I'm going to take some GPS and put it away in a Faraday cage or some other mechanism to try to protect it? Absolutely. Just in the off chance that a satellite is still working. Our government, high-level government and military are already to some extent protected. I've now seen in the most recent studies that even the military's protection against EMP isn't quite enough. The study that was done by the military that generated their military specification, which is also linked to in the resources, was done to protect communications equipment. And it's not designed to protect other equipment like vehicles and other things. It is now very much in doubt, or somewhat in doubt, I should say, in the latest stuff that I've seen, that even the military's, at least the initial work they did on EMP protection might not even protect them. Air Force One is EMP protected, but I do think that the military, the minute they know about this, they're going to move on this, because they are the type of organization that does something about things typically. When it's in their control, they do it. When they got to depend on government, when they got to depend on Congress for things, it slows them down. But within them, I don't have any doubt that they're going to move and get things done. NORAD. If you remember NORAD, some of you people that might be my age, North American Aerospace Defense Command. This is basically where they control all of our nuclear weapons from and monitor other countries' nuclear attacks against us. All of that used to be, when I was a kid, in a mountain called Cheyenne Mountain, in an underground bunker, literally under the mountain or in the mountain. And that was done to protect us from a nuclear weapon attack. When the Soviet Union went down, and sometime during the 90s, NORAD was actually moved out of that mountain, and that mountain was shut down. Well, guess what's happened? They moved back into the mountain, and it was because of an EMP attack scenario that they moved back into the mountain. This news came out when NORAD's commander, Admiral William E. Gortney, in 2015 basically announced it during a conference that they were moving back into the mountain, or had moved in. It's moving because of the very nature of the way that Cheyenne Mountain is built. It's EMP hardened. This is the Admiral who was in charge of our nuclear systems and detection systems, and they moved into the mountain because it's EMP hardened. They did that. That should tell you something. The other item I have here for the government is that the fleet, the Navy, that is out at sea will survive, but I don't know that that'll be much help to us. So look back at the list that I just went through and realize that none of those services, utilities, none of that will be available after an EMP. Some of them might last a couple of days. Many will stop immediately. What does that really mean? Let's take a very simple, straightforward approach to figure this out, and that's in the next video, which is an EMP scenario walkthrough. And in that video, I'm going to walk you through some information as well as show you a video that I put together that shows you what an EMP might at least be like. Somewhat, but I think the point of this next video is to make you think. Put yourself in that situation. Pick a day next week, a time in a day, and say, where am I likely to be at this time and at this date? Well, I'm probably likely to be at work, or I might be at home, or whatever. And say, okay, knowing what this EMP is like now, what would happen? What would I do? What would happen to me? What would happen to my family if and when that happened? I did that exercise. That's what triggered this entire meetup. I actually stopped and went through that in my head and realized how poorly prepared I was and how scary that situation, my scenario, how scary it was. When I saw that, I started to put together the meetup and ramp up my prepping. So anyway, for now, let's stop, and we'll pick it up in the next video.